אוקיי, שלום לכולם, ערב טוב, ברוכים הבאים לעוד מפגש בסדרת ההרצאות המקוונת של האגודה הישראלית לחקר דתות. בעצם אנחנו במפגש הרביעי בסדרה השנתית שלנו, כשאנחנו עוסקים בעצם השנה בתמה שהיא דת חומרית, דת ותרבות חומרית. ולפני שנגיע ככה להרצאה של פרופסור סרנה, שלשמה התכנסנו, כן, אז אני אציג אותו. אגב, למי שלא מכיר, שמי שי פררו, דוקטור שי פררו, אני מזכיר האגודה הישראלית לחקר דתות. אני בדיוק ככה נותן לעוד אנשים ככה הזדמנות להיכנס לכאן לזום, ואנחנו נתחיל בכך שאני אציג את פרופסור סרנה, אוקיי? ואני אעשה את זה באנגלית. As here it goes, Ken. So we are delighted to have with us Professor Jonathan D. Sarna. He's the university professor and the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. He also is the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, and he's the chief historian of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. He's the author or editor of more than 30 books on American Jewish history and life. His book, American Judaism, A History, now in its second edition, won 6 awards, including the 2004 Everett Jewish Book of the Year Award from the Jewish Book Council. And Sarna is a fellow both of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Jewish Research, and he holds 5 honorary degrees. His most recent books are Coming to Terms with America, which is a volume of essays now translated into Hebrew under the title Zehuyot Bemifgash, בהוצאת Mercaz Shazar, and also Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in Gilded Age America, co-edited with Adam Mendelsohn. So thank you very much, Professor Sarna. The floor, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it's really wonderful to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person, as I said earlier, Libi B'Mizrach. But I hope that on the one hand, this will divert, but on the other hand, it's in Yana de Yoma. Now, matzah is in many ways the original and most authentic Jewish food. It's, of course, described in the Tanakh and carefully regulated by rabbinic law, modified by local custom. The process was refined through the centuries and divided into a series of well-measured sequential steps, which have to be completed within 18 minutes, some say 17 and a half. And it's also, and this is sometimes forgotten, it's characterized by a careful division of labor and gendered. Men and women had separate and somewhat unequal roles here. That's supposed to be Yaakov Yosef, by the way, the then chief rabbi of New York. Here you see women who are doing the rolling, and the heavy work was done by men. And that gender division of labor was common throughout the Jewish world. Poor women, widows, orphans did the kneading, strong men did the baking and the lifting. Now, in the 19th century, when industrialization came in, processes like matzah making began to be mechanized, and reputedly the first mechanical matzah machine, so it's reported in all the books, was invented by Isaac Singer in Alsace in 1838. But actually, that machine only covered one part of the process, the critical and very labor-intensive kneading of the dough. But anyway, Singer's machine and variants of it did eventually win approval from various rabbis. It spread, shortening the process of matzah baking and depriving, as a result, lots of poor women and widows and orphans of their meager livelihoods. But at the same time, as machines are wont to do, the machine greatly increased the supply of matzah, which was critical given the very rapid growth of the world Jewish population in the 19th century. Vayirbu vayatzmu bim'od ma'od reflects the reality of the 19th century when so many more people lived because of better nutrition and vaccines. And in addition, the machine led to a reduction in the price of matzah since fewer hands were needed to produce it. And that, of course, leads to an interesting moral question. Is it better to reduce the price of matzah for everyone by introducing a machine, or is it better to protect the poor by keeping the machine out? Every time there's innovation, these questions come up today in AI, but it certainly played a role in the debate, the great debate over machine-made matzah. In 1858, the question was posed, Reb Shlomo Kluger of Brody, as to whether machine-made matzah was actually kosher, should it be allowed? And in a famous tshuva, he decided that the answer was no, and he set forth 4 claims against the matzah machine, and those claims more or less defined the debate. First of all, he put forth a halachic argument that matzah baking requires human exertion and intent. Obviously, he said a machine doesn't have intent. Second, he felt the machine wasn't reliable in preventing chametz from entering the process. Third, and many people believe most important to him, was the social justice concern, that it would deprive poor people of the meager living they made from baking matzah. Kluger came from a poor family. And the fourth point was a kind of emotional point, that the machine was an innovation and it would become a dangerous instrument of modernity. And we know where that leads: assimilation, reform, apostasy, so to speak. Eat machine-made matzah today, intermarry tomorrow. It can lead who knows where. But it so happens that there was another view on the matter, and that was a response by another famous posek, Yosef Shol Nathanson of Lemberg or Lvov, depending on what day it was. Nathanson was actually Kluger's brother-in-law, and he annulled Kluger's ruling and declared that machine-made matzah was preferable and cleaner and actually more kosher than the handmade, because there was much less room for error. debate went back and forth, but as a practical matter, machine-made matzah proved much more successful in newer communities than in old established ones. So Jews in Galicia and Hasidic Jews opposed the machine-made matzah. Some of their descendants still do. Western and Central European Jews, as well as Lithuanian Jews and the newer immigrants to Eretz Yisrael, tended to accept the machine. And that brings me to America. The matzah machine arrived in the United States at an early date. It's the first discussion I've found is in 1850. And in the 20th century, with not a lot of disagreement. In other words, the European machloket didn't quite make it initially to America. The matzah, machine-made matzah, captured the market. And how this happened really has much to do with this man. He diffused the issue and saw his machine-made matzah really redefine what authentic matzah is, and he captured the market. And that's really my focus for the rest of this talk. This man, Ber Manischewitz does not seem to have been his name in Lithuania. He was a Lithuanian Jew, was close to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, which gave him a lot of legitimacy and status, and he emigrated to America, probably to escape persecution. The Jews were expelled from where he lived, and also to find a better life for his family. He comes to Cincinnati quite early, 1886, and soon entered the matzah business. Now, because of rising population, demand for matzah grew very rapidly. In the United States, there were easily 100,000 or more immigrants in the 1880s. And because there were rather low standards for making matzah, there were all sorts of scandals and accusations. So there was room for a man who had this reputation for piety. He'd worked for Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He could gain a clientele. But what's interesting, to me at least, about Manischewitz is that he was deeply interested in technology. And this is why it's relevant to this group, what he does is yoke modern technology to the service of Judaism, and over time introduces a whole series of new processes into matzah baking, some of which he invented, some of which he borrowed. There are various patents that are in his name. And this is his son, Jacob Uriah Manischewitz. I pulled a variety of patents. I don't read patents, but you can basically see how they developed these machines. By 1903, he's using 3 different machines as part of matzah making process. One that kneaded the dough, one that rolled the dough, and one that stretched the dough, perforated it, cut it, and he also used fans to keep the premises cool. Later, he introduces a gas-fired matzah baking oven. That was very good because it allowed for better, more even distribution and control of heat. And then an enormously important and patented traveling carrier bake oven, which basically was a conveyor belt system that automated the whole process of matzah baking. You could put the dough in on one end, and it slowly moved through the different stations and emerged as evenly baked, identically shaped matzah on the other. He, along with his son, he then also invents an electric eye which counts the number of matzahs, by the way, at a rate of 600 a minute, and innovations in packing. If you've ever seen Manischewitz matzah, even today, the matzah is heavily packed together so it doesn't break. And by 1920, they've invented what they called in the press a matzah machine that could produce 1.25 million matzahs every day, and reputedly the largest and most expensive piece of machinery in any bakery in the world. And the result was really a revolution, and that's why it's so interesting for your broader topic. He could produce more matzah more cheaply, with less breakage, and with a much more regular and pleasing appearance than ever before possible. And of course, throughout the diaspora, especially in Israel, you see certain parallel industries, parallel groups. Some of them worked with Manischewitz, some of them copied him. But the point is that we see a revolution in matzah characterized here by three major transformations. I want to remind you, we have an image that, matzah can't change. It's the same matzah that our ancestors ate leaving Egypt. But in real life, it was revolutionized. Before, matzah had been round, irregular, oval-shaped. Now, really because of the demands of technology and packaging, it became square. Those who know America know, and actually it was true everywhere, the earliest cookies all were square, graham crackers and the like, and square also meant that you didn't have leftovers as you would have had if it was round, and that would have posed problems of kashrut as well. The second, in addition to being square, when you have handmade matzah, each matzah is unique and distinctive in terms of shape and texture and appearance. No two are the same. Anyone who knows shmura matzah knows that. But the newfangled machine-made matzah, everyone came out looking and feeling and tasting the same. In other words, matzah underwent the very same processes of rationalization, standardization, mechanization that we associate with the management revolution of this period, often credited to Frederick Winslow Taylor. In other words, Manischewitz became a distinctive brand of matzah with all that implied. And finally, where matzah traditionally was a quintessentially local product, produced on an as-needed basis in every Jewish community, and not shipped vast distances because you feared it would break. Thanks to Manischewitz, it became a national and then an international brand, just like soup and cereal, maybe I should say lahavdil, in time, along with brands, smaller ones like Horowitz Margaret and Goodman Strikes in the United States. Manischewitz extended its market share. It mass-produced matzah. Local matzah bakeries went out of business. And anyone who knows the history of Procter & Gamble, which also was in Cincinnati, I can't find an absolute direct relationship. Indeed, Procter didn't hire Jews, but it seems to me likely that they at least knew what Procter & Gamble was doing to other soap, detergent. Later, they bought up cookies as well. But there is a great difference between matzah and what Procter & Gamble was doing. And that great difference was that Manischewitz had to overcome two very significant challenges. The first I mentioned, matzah is a traditional food. We know from the study of religion, people don't like to change old rituals. If their ancestors ate it in Egypt, it's unlikely that they cut open a box of matzah. And that was very tough. They had to find a way to make matzah seem not only superior, but religiously authentic. Unless it seemed authentic, it wouldn't succeed. And second of all, they had to overcome this rabbinic resistance to machine-made matzah. In other words, they needed a very strong rabbinic endorsement. And it's quite clear that the Manischewitzes were quite worried about it. But let's take these one at a time. They confronted the first issue, how to make it superior and authentic, through advertising. And it's very interesting. I mean, one could give a whole lecture just on the advertisements of Manischewitz. They described it as in all ways superior to the competition, a temple of kashrus, a palace of cleanliness, a gigantic structure of steel and glass overlooking light, air, overflowing with light, air, and sunshine. This is fascinating because actually handmade matzah was usually made in a basement and dingy, and suddenly you see kind of American food and health standards of the early 20th century connected to matzah, and matzah becomes a therapeutic food. And that remains true even today. People think, it's got alamalas, as we said technically, gluten-free and so on. And you even have one ad that says no human hand touches these matzahs, as if that rather than handmade matzah were the highest precept. In other words, they appeal to American consumer values to sell this traditional food. And if you buy Manischewitz matzah, say they, then you can subscribe to the highest values of Judaism and America. Note, at one time they called them American matzahs, and they don't say it's the best handmade matzah, the finest matzah in 3,500 years. It's better, say they, than the handmade stuff there. And when you look not at the English, but at the Hebrew and the Yiddish ads, you see more of that. I don't have a slide of it, but they tout the company's scrupulousness in all aspects of matzah making and utter reliability, attested to by rabbonim around the world. In the early years, they even did something clever. They marketed their matzah as an elite product. Note, here it doesn't call them American matzahs. This is earlier. It's fine matzahs. But in addition, this is a cigar type box. And at least in America, that had an aura of affluence. The rich smoked cigars. Your matzah is like a fine a cigar, so to speak. It's an elite product. It gives an aura of affluence and gave matzah extra cachet. They, of course, understood that if it becomes the preferred matzah of the rich and the powerful, every other Jew would follow suit. And the strategy must have worked because in the 1920s, they claim that they deliver 80% of the matzah delivered, or I should rephrase it, 80% of the matzah delivered in North America was Manischewitz matzah. That's an extraordinary percentage. But as I said, they had two hurdles to overcome. The other was, how do you make sure that rabbis approve it and you don't get into trouble from rabbis telling their flock and not to buy it? And this is especially the case since, as I argued in a different article, after 1924, the number of rabbis goes up, but the number of Jews doesn't go up nearly as much. Immigration is virtually cut off, falls to 10,000 a year, but rabbis can come in outside the quota. That's a different article, but that meant you were more and more worried about these rabbonim. And so Manischewitz works hard to get rabbinic endorsement, as you can see here. And I think it had two great advantages peculiar to America. First of all, especially in the early years, the majority of East European immigrants came from areas like Lithuania, where machine-made matzah had won rabbinic sanction, and Lithuanian Jews, and certainly the kind willing to cross the ocean to America, tended to favor accommodations to modernity. If you were so opposed and worried about the Chayfen and Medina, you wouldn't have ventured to the New World in the first place. That's why Hasidim only come, for the most part, after World War II. Second of all, and this is not as frequently recognized, rabbis opposed to machine-made matzah wrote early in the 20th century that America is different and it's okay in America. And the reason is simple. In the absence of machine-made matzah, the very fast-growing American Jewish community, remember always that there are only about 250,000 Jews in America in 1881, but by the 20s, there were almost 4 million. And there was no way that you could have enough handmade matzah for such a community. And so even people who opposed it in Europe said in America, America's underish in this respect, as Chabad would be told. And you didn't have to maintain the older tradition. America is different. But Manischewitz worked very, very hard to ensure rabbinic endorsement. And that's what interests me. It published a list of 124 Gedolei Hador, who it said visited the Manischewitz bakery and attested to its kashrut. It also maintained very close relations with Eretz Yisrael. Manischewitz himself had studied there. His children studied there and married into Jerusalem families. And then they brought over from Israel a mashgiach, Mendel Hochstein. There are Hochsteins in Israel and in America today. I don't know if they are descendants of this Hochstein. But anyway, this Rav Hochstein, he from Jerusalem, oversaw and signed that he was the mashgiach of Manischewitz Matzah. And most interestingly, really fascinatingly, the Manischewitz company established a yeshiva in Jerusalem known as Rabbi Ber Manishewitz's yeshiva. I've actually met people who remembered the Manischewitz yeshiva. Now, it's actually very curious that they called it, that they did this. First of all, what business purpose would it serve? But second of all, why did they call it Manischewitz? If you go through the yeshivas, they may, even if they're named for someone, they don't use the last name, Torat Yosef or something like that. Eitz Chaim, they don't carry a last name. Why didn't they call it Yeshivas Dover? Why Manischewitz? Fortunately for me, there was a court case in the United States Tax Court, and I would have to say that this was where it began my interest in the whole subject. But if you read the whole case, the Manischewitz company, which was deducting all of its contributions to Yeshivas Manischewitz, they explain that yeshiva graduates teach as rabbis in Palestine, Europe, and South America. They have the name Manischewitz associated with them and are helping to overcome the impression of Orthodox European Jews that American machine-made matzahs are not kosher. That's a quote from the court case, and you can even see it on the screen there. In other words, Manischewitz Yeshiva formed part of a much larger strategy aimed at utilizing the prestige of Rabbonim, especially from Eretz Yisrael, to legitimate the machine-made square matzahs that Manischewitz produced in America and wanted to promote around the world. The rabbis who taught at that yeshiva sanctioned the use of matzah, machine-made matzah on Pesach, and of course Manischewitz supplied that matzah. And they were, if one wanted to use contemporary parlance, they were the vanguard of a worldwide matzah empire to spread machine-made matzah beyond the borders of North America to Jews throughout the diaspora and Palestine. Those yeshiva students whom they trained were future missionaries for the cause of machine-made matzah, as well as living symbols of those Jewish values, piety, charity, commitment to Jewish learning that would make Manischewitz matzah trusted and welcome in Jewish homes everywhere. And I have to say that at least for a time, Manischewitz gained a reputation in Europe as being the most kosher matzah of all. I know that because my maternal grandmother in London, scion of a very distinguished rabbinic line, Landau Horowitz, and she preferred Manischewitz matzah for this very reason. She wouldn't eat Rekusen or a local English brand. I remember in my youth, we would send her Manischewitz. And that's astonishing when one remembers America's reputation among Orthodox Jews as being lax in all matters of religion, a kind of a Treifena Medina. So really, thanks to all of this, in a very short time, I mean, it took 2 generations, centuries of matzah habits were transformed, and the large majority of Jews throughout the world came to celebrate Pesach with machine-made matzah. Now, today, and I don't bring it quite to today, because Manischewitz doesn't exist as an independent entity. It's part of a huge conglomerate. There's really no difference between Goodman's, Horowitz, Margaretten, and Manischewitz. They're all made in the same plant, only the box is different, and the ownership is different. And then Israeli matzah has become a significant factor. And because of the interest in artisan food, our so-called artisan shmura matzah has made a comeback, certainly in some Orthodox circles. But the achievements of Manischewitz shouldn't be forgotten. Its transformation of matzah provides a very unusual case study of the interrelationship of business, technology, charity, and faith. And in a way, it's a triumph of the idea that modernity and tradition can be harmonized. And here you see Manischewitz matzah, although not anymore owned by the family, is still served, and they are still using some of those same advertising techniques as were used by Bear Manischewitz more than a century ago. So thank you, and Chag Kasher v'Sameach. And now we have about 20 minutes for your insights, and let me, how do I do it? Stop share. Your insights, questions, and disagreements. Bakasha, Shai. אפשר לשאול בעברית אם זה יותר קל. בבקשה. Yeah.